If you saw the title of my talk, it's Political Parties, Primary Elections and the Constitution, History, Practice, and Reform. I admit it's not the most creative or amusing title. In fact, if I was giving the title, if I was making up the title today, I would have put in there somewhere Polarization, because a lot of what I want to talk about and eventually get to about the primary elections involves polarization, causes of polarization, efforts to combat polarization, and that's a really critical part of all of this. And I know it's one I want to talk about. So, I'll eventually get to that in the reform section of my talk here tonight. But before we get there, I'll also talk about practice. In other words, how Colorado conducts its primary elections. And interestingly enough, Colorado's primary election system was challenged in federal court just a couple of months ago as unconstitutional. And the attorney for the plaintiffs in that case was a former Constitution Week speaker, whose name is, I'm not going to reveal it yet, because I got a key. I know you're all on the edge of your seats to find out, but I will tell you when we get to that. If I said it now, everyone get up and leave. But how about that? Interestingly enough, I didn't know that until I started looking into it. But before we do the practice and the reform and the polarization stuff, as I always like to do, is wind back the clock a little bit to the history of this topic. Where did it come from? How have we gotten to where we are today with this system? And that's always an important part of understanding the subject matter and the issues involved with it. So the history, and I'm going to flip here to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Historically speaking, political parties were private organizations. They were non-governmental private organizations, more akin to something like Lions Club or the Rotary, and they came out of just local clubs, local elite clubs often, that just formed together to promote political interests. And this is where parties came from. They were not the government, right? These are non-governmental organizations. These still are today. But as the parties developed, political parties became just way more involved and important and influential with the governmental and especially the electoral system. And it became to such an extent that state governments and the population at large, in the early 20th century, started becoming somewhat suspicious of political parties, and specifically about how political parties selected their nominees. Because back in the day, historically speaking, the good old days, the parties the leaders of the party, they just met in some room with the doors closed. They smoked cigars and drank brandy, and they decided who the nominee was going to be. And nobody knew how that decision was made or why that decision was made, and nobody could participate in it. Right? None of the people could participate in this nominating process. And so there was suspicion about potential corruption that was going on in this nominating process. What kind of deals were being made behind these closed doors in these smoky rooms to select these nominees? What kind of promises were being made to these nominees to secure the nomination? Or what kind of promises were being given from these nominees to secure the nomination? Or what money exchanged hands for this person to secure the party's nomination? Nobody knew. Nobody knew what was going on behind those closed doors. There was suspicion of corruption. There was probably, corruption involved some sort of, back behind the scenes wheeling and dealing. So state governments, they responded to this, and they responded to this by enacting legislation that said political parties, you have now become so influential, so important, so integrated in the governing and the electoral process that you need to hold primary elections. You need to bring this nominating process out into the open, make it more transparent. And that's what happened. And a lot of states started doing this in the early 20th century, and political parties looked at this and said, okay, well, everybody look at this. That's a pretty good idea. Let's bring it out to the open. Let's let everyone participate and let everyone vote. It's more transparent. It's more democratic. But the political party said, wait a second, government, you can't tell us how to select our leaders. No, we're not the government. We're a private organization. We're a non-government organization. We have First Amendment rights of freedom of association. And that is true. the Supreme Court has long held that the First Amendment provides rights of association. Now, if you know the First Amendment, some of you might have your handy pocket constitutions on you. You can look it up, or maybe even have it memorized. But the First Amendment itself has 5 different rights within it. Right? Hopefully, I remember them: speech, press, religion, assembly, and redress of grievances. So you don't have a specific right of association enumerated in the First Amendment, but the Supreme Court has, for a long time, non-controversially found this right to a freedom of association. So in other words, we could tonight, if we wanted to form a group, form an association. It could be the Grand Lake Association for skiing waist deep powder. Okay, let's call it the Grand Lake Association for skiing waist deep powder. The government cannot prevent us from coming together to promote our powder skiing interests. They cannot tell us where to meet or when to meet, or if we need an executive committee or a subcommittee, or how we select our leader, whether it's by election or whether it's by lot, or whether it's just by 1 or 2 people choosing, or by alphabet, whatever it is, right? We would be a private organization, and we have First Amendment rights to freedom of association, where the government cannot tell us what to do. So this is what political parties responded with when states tried to regulate how they select their leaders. I'm going to pause here and take a sip of this. I promise it's not alcoholic. So this is what the states said, and they had Supreme Court decisions to back them up, that they do have these First Amendment rights of association. Now, even though that is true, that you have these First Amendment rights of association, you have to weigh those rights of First Amendment rights against rights to vote and rights to the equal protection of the laws. And the Lions Club, the Rotary, or the Grand Lake Powder Association, we're private organizations, and we're not involved in governing or electing. But what the court looked at was arguments that said, yes, you're a non-government organization, you have First Amendment rights, but you are so integrated with, so integral to, so inextricable from the governing process, and specifically the electoral process, that states can regulate how political parties, non-governing private organizations, how political parties select their leaders. And not only that, but individuals have constitutional freedom rights against what political parties can do. So political parties cannot violate our individual freedom rights to vote or individual freedom rights to equal protection of the laws. Now, this is an interesting ordeal. We have a conflict between constitutional rights and constitutional doctrine. First Amendment versus voting and equal protection. So you kind of First Amendment versus 14th and 15th Amendment. How is this going to be resolved? What is going to be the answer to this? Well, as it turns out, the Supreme Court dealt with this exact question in a series of cases during the 1930s and 40s to answer this question and to finally resolve this issue. And these series of cases came out of the state of Texas, and what happened was the Democratic Party in the state of Texas, and you have to remember now, this is the 30s and 40s. The Democratic Party, from the Civil War to the party realignment after the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. The Democratic Party was the party of Jim Crow and segregation. And so in the 30s and 40s, that was very much true, especially in the South. And so the Democratic Party in Texas said, you know what, the 14th Amendment is true, it's there. The 15th Amendment is true, it's there. But the 14th and 15th Amendment protect voting rights and equal protection rights against state action. And we, the Texas Democratic Party, we're not the state, we're not the government, we're a private organization. So you know what we're going to do? We're not going to let anybody vote in our primaries except white people. Only white people are allowed to vote. And the Supreme Court at first in the 1930s heard this case. And the Supreme Court said, you know what? There's nothing we could do about this. The political party is a private organization. Obviously, Texas cannot deprive any person of their individual freedom right to vote or their individual freedom right to equal protection, but Texas isn't doing this. It's the Democratic Party, this non-government organization. And so that was the decision that came down in the 30s. And this was a common theme throughout the South in the Democratic Party. You have to remember, at this time, the South was a one-party region. It was the Democratic Party, and that was it. So whoever won the Democratic nomination won that seat, to whether it's a state legislature or the House of Representatives, the Senate, whatever it might be. So essentially, this disenfranchised all but white voters in Texas. So this did not end the story, though. This system was continuously challenged, and in a very important landmark case in 1944 called Smith versus Allwright, the Supreme Court reversed itself. And the Supreme Court said once and for all, definitively, that political parties, because of how integrated they are, I was mentioning how integrated, integral, inextricable from the electoral process, then they're not really entirely private organizations, right? They're not the government, but they're not entirely private organizations. They inhabit this sort of middle ground. But that middle ground is enough where the political party cannot deprive individuals of their right to vote. They cannot deprive individuals of the right to equal protection of the laws. And that was it. That settled the issue. So states can govern, big states can regulate political parties, and political parties, when they're conducting their procedures for selecting their nominees, they cannot deprive individuals of the right to vote or their equal protection rights. Now, I'm going to take another sip of this, sorry. Dramatic pause. Now, although this settled that without question, and still has never since then been challenged, it didn't entirely answer all the questions between this weighing of First Amendment freedom of association rights versus voting and equal protection rights, and how far states can go in regulating political parties in their primary selection nomination process. And since the 40s, since Smith versus Allwright, there have been numerous cases that have gone all the way up to the Supreme Court involving just how far state governments can go in telling political parties how they can or how they cannot run their nominating procedures. And that is very true up to and including today. Now, I mentioned before that Colorado's system of the primary election was challenged as unconstitutional just this year. And if you all might remember, but on our 2016 ballots, there was a measure, a referendum measure on there asking Colorado voters whether, yes or no, whether they want to implement what's called a semi-open primary system in Colorado. And that semi-open, and this referendum, this ballot measure passed. And in 2018, it was implemented, and this has been our system for the last 4 years. And what that semi-open primary means is that a political party must, and I'm talking about the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans. There's different rules for minor parties, but we'll talk about them tonight, maybe next year. What this ballot measure said was that the two major political parties, they have to conduct primary elections in order to select their nominees, and they even have to allow independent, unaffiliated voters to participate in that process, even if they don't want them to. Meaning me, right, unaffiliated voter, I get 2 ballots. Even though I'm not a member of the Republican Party or a member of the Democratic Party, I can still, state of Colorado says I can still have a say in how those parties select their leaders, right? Interesting. Well, sure enough, there were certain candidates in this year's primaries, this only happened a few months ago, that sued the state of Colorado and said this isn't fair, right? You can't make us allow non-members of our party participate, have a say in who our leader is going to be. That's not fair. That goes too far into invading our First Amendment rights of association. We're not discriminating against anyone, right? We're not taking away anyone's right to vote, but you can't, you cannot go that far into our First Amendment rights of association. In some ways, that's a reasonable argument. I mean, if someone knocked on our door at the Grand Lake Association for Skiing Powder and said, hey, I want to join your association and vote, I'm a snowboarder. Hell no, we're not letting snowboarders in our association, But no way we're allowing snowboarders anywhere near us. And if a snowboarder gets into our association somehow, there's no chance we're letting them vote. Maybe they could be a part somehow, but there's no chance we're letting them vote, right? And the government can't tell us that we can't do that. We're a completely, we have those First Amendment rights of association. So this is essentially the argument that was made by the plaintiffs in this case, and this just happened a couple months ago, and it was, none other than the somewhat controversial figure, to say the least, former Constitution Week Speaker John Eastman, who represented the plaintiffs in this case, and he made this argument before the U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado, saying it's just too far. It's just going too far. And what the court said, the court actually rejected this argument. And what the court said was that, and here's kind of some of the detail, but this is really the kicker, is that the Colorado statute setting up our process for semi-open primaries says that political parties, the Democratic and Republican parties, they can opt out. They're permitted to opt out of the primary election system, which means that we all kind of take it. I took it for granted that the parties select their nominee by a primary election, where you get a ballot and you fill it out and send it in like it's official ballot. But that's actually not the case, because the parties can opt out of that procedure and actually select their nominee through a convention system where they have delegates and they choose. And if they choose that convention system, then that convention system, which is not administered or funded by the state of Colorado, unlike the primary election system, which is funded and administered by the state of Colorado, the political party, if they have that convention, then they can say only members of the party can vote, right? And it's easy enough to join the party, right? That's what the party says. If someone wants to vote in our primary, let them join the party. There's nothing stopping them from registering with the party and becoming a member. But the really interesting detail in this statute, in this case, is that in order for the party to opt out of the primary system, they need a 3/4 majority vote of the state the state party central committee, right? And the states have committees. They have committees at different levels, local up to the state level, and the state central committee of the party has to vote by 3/4 majority to opt out of the primary system. And what Eastman argued, what these plaintiffs argued, was that, well, that's such a severe burden to overcome. Nothing passes with 3/4 majority in politics. It's essentially impossible. Why not a simple majority? Why not 51% or even 2/3? But 3/4, it's essentially saying that you cannot opt out, that you have to have this primary election, and you have to allow people who are not a member of your party vote to have a say in who your leader is going to be. And I think somewhat of a reasonable argument. But the judge, the district court, and this is in federal court district judge said that the 3/4 majority is actually, it's not too severe a burden. It's not impossible for the state central committee, party central committee to actually vote to opt out. And so because of that, because they have that option, then I, the federal court judge, I don't even need to reach that question of which rights prevail, your First Amendment freedom of association rights, or your the rights to vote and the authority of the state government to regulate you. So somewhat of an anticlimactic end to that little story. But what I really expect, and I would bank anything on this, is that this is going to be an issue that comes up again, if not in the next primary election cycle, even sooner, where this system that Colorado has right now, the semi-open primary system, gets challenged as an unconstitutional violation of the First Amendment rights of association of the political parties. And there are some other states that also have this same or substantially similar system that Colorado has, and there's a very good likelihood that those states' laws will be challenged as well. And I would also very much expect that if that ends up happening, which I think it might, it'll go all the way up to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court hears these cases over the years about the rights of political parties. And especially if there's a circuit split, so a lot of times certain federal circuit courts of appeals, like Colorado's in the 10th Circuit, if the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals comes out and says it does violate First Amendment rights, and the 9th Circuit or 3rd Circuit comes out and says it doesn't violate the party's First Amendment rights, a very, very high likelihood, those are the kinds of cases that the Supreme Court tends to hear, where there's those circuit splits, because they want to settle whatever that law is to make sure there's an understandable, uniform rule across the country, and especially when it's something as important and as relevant as political party primary nominations. I would be very surprised if it didn't go to the Supreme Court. So I know all of you are going to just be on the edge of your seats following this absolutely fascinating legal development, as I will be. And keep an eye out for it, because I certainly expect it to happen. If it does, it's going to be very interesting and have a very big impact on how primary elections are conducted, and it could even change how Colorado is conducting its primary elections now. So that's some of that's kind of a background of what Colorado does with its primary elections. As I said, there's different rules for third parties. And there's a lot more that goes into this too, into this lawsuit, into these rules for political parties and for ballot access, and it's a very interesting topic, and it gets very granular. I'm happy to answer some more questions about it during the Q&A. But it's really fundamental to how our politics work, because it really determines who gets elected, and not only who gets elected, but what their incentives are when they're in office for getting reelected. And so that moves us somewhat into this next topic, which is reform of this primary system and issues of polarization. Anyone else have a cocktail out there? Kenzie? Cheers. Cheers, Kenzie. Just me and my wife. That's what I like about that. I mean, it's Grand Lake, We used to sell beer at these events. Do you remember that, Mike? Why don't we do that anymore? We used to sell. Let's have a conversation about that after this. Maybe we can, associate together and make change. Okay, so let me just look down and make sure I'm not forgetting anything here before we move into the reform. Okay, so there are really volumes of research, mostly in the political science field, but also in the law and constitutional field, on primary elections and their impact on polarization. And most of this research comes from essentially two very basic premises. The premises is one, that during primary elections, voter turnout is very low. The percentage of eligible voters to vote that turnout in primary elections is very low. Somewhere maybe around, it could be as low as single digits, and it varies, of course, on the year and the jurisdiction, but they're very, very low. That's premise one, voter turnout very low in primary elections. Premise two is that the voters that do turn out in primary elections tend to be, right, not always, but tend to be the most partisan voters, tend to be the most polarized voters. Right? These are the very politically engaged, they're very politically active, they're very politically aware, they're following all this stuff, and when the primaries come around, when a lot of other people might not even know it, boy, are they there, right? So those are the two real premises. Very low turnout in primary elections, and those who do turn out tend to be the most partisan and the most polarized. And what I'm talking about is very much true for both parties. Right? Everything I'm about to say also is very much true for both parties. Okay, and there's debate out there, and I'm not familiar with this with the arguments on both sides. There's debate on like which side is worse or more polarized or whatever the case is. But I don't really care about that. The fact is that both parties are very much a part of this. Okay, so what does that mean that you get these two premises? What does that mean? Well, it means that the candidates who are elected out of the primary system, in order to get elected, they have to cater to those primary voters. And because those primary voters are very few and very polarized, then guess what? The candidates that get elected by those primary voters are also very partisan and also very polarized. And then when we get to the general election, that always has much higher turnout than the primary elections, and has more moderate voters. What you have is these more moderate voters only being able to choose from two polarized, very highly partisan candidates. And there's plenty of political science theory that says that as polarized as the primary candidates might end up being, they do have to move to the center in the general election to please the general electorate, because the general electorate is more centrist. That is only true to some extent, and it doesn't always play out that way. And it also often leads to general electorate dissatisfaction with the options that they have to choose from. Now, I think this is basically true. You're going to find exceptions to this in different jurisdictions, at different levels of government, but overall, this is generally true. And it makes sense, right? I think what I've just explained makes very perfect sense. And one of the outcomes of this is that the candidates who are in office, right, if they want to get reelected before they go to that general electorate, that tends to be more moderate, they can't even get there unless they win their primary. And so when they're in office, what do they have to do if they want to get reelected? They have to say things, they have to do things, they have to act in a certain way that is going to win over their primary electorate. And if they don't, then they're going to get primaried, right? You've probably heard this term, getting primaried. Right? There's a whole book. The title is Getting Primaried, right? And this is very much what happens. And it happens in either two ways. Either you get primaried and you lose your primary election, and this is true on both sides, remember, or you modify your behavior when you're in office. The things you say, the things you do, the way you vote for legislation. You modify your behavior when you're in office so that when you go and face your primary electorate, you win. Right? So you either get primaried or it changes the incentives and the behavior of the candidates so that they don't get primaried. But whichever one of those happens, the outcome is always that those candidates who go through that primary election are polarized. They have to be. If they're not polarized, then they lose. And that is in general very true across the political spectrum for both the Republican and the Democratic parties at all levels of government, local, state, and federal. And this, to the extent that this is a problem, I tend to think polarization is somewhat of a problem, and it's something that's worth trying to solve or trying to lessen, trying to mitigate. And states have taken steps at doing so. So what the whole reason behind Colorado having the semi-open primaries where independents and affiliated voters are allowed to vote for the parties is the idea, the theory that, well, if there's more independents voting in these primary elections, then there'll be more votes for more moderate candidates coming out of those primary elections. And whether that theory is true or not, is somewhat beside the point. But that the idea is to try to counteract that extreme polarization, and so Colorado is that semi-open primary that Colorado has is somewhat of an effort to combat that polarization. Now, other states have taken steps at this also, and even more drastic steps. And the state I want to talk about is actually Alaska, because for two reasons. I'm going to take a dramatic pause again. I think this is also being streamed live, and my parents are watching on the East Coast, so I want to say hi to them. Hi, Mom. So I want to talk about Alaska for two reasons. One is they have taken the most, I just heard my phone ding. I wonder if that was There are, so two reasons for Alaska. One is that they have taken the farthest step to amend their primary election process in order to counteract polarization. And two is that I was just in Alaska this spring heli skiing and just absolutely ripping powder lines all over the Chugach Mountains. And is there any place, besides Grand Lake, any place better than Alaska? So any chance I get to talk about Alaska, I like to bring it up. Chris was just there. Hey, Chris. So what did Alaska do? Well, Alaska opened its primaries to a completely nonpartisan primary, something like California did. And if you're in Alaska, you get your primary ballot. Everyone gets the exact same ballot, and there's just a whole bunch of candidates on there. And anyone and everyone votes for the same ballot. And the candidates are, they can say what party they're registered for. In California, they can say what party they prefer, right? It's not, it doesn't say this is the Republican nominee or this is the Democratic nominee. It just says, in California, the party they prefer, and on the Alaska ballot, just as the party that they're registered in. And so you have many Democrats, many Republicans, many third parties, many independents on this Alaska ballot. In fact, if anyone was following this, you actually had Santa Claus was on the Alaska primary ballot. I'm not sure what the story is about it, but I think there was like 40-something people on the ballot. And then the top 4 vote getters in this open primary election move on to the general election. It doesn't matter what party they belong to, right? There could be 4 Republicans in the general election. There could be 4 Democrats. There could be any combination of the two. And then in the general election in Alaska, the voters actually rank the 4 candidates in the order that they prefer them. And so there's a number of ideas behind this. The one idea at the primary level for opening up as nonpartisan is that you're going to have candidates that, if they want to move from the primary stage to the general election stage, they're going to have to appeal to many voters in the middle, maybe on the other side, independents, Democrats, whoever it is. They're going to have to appeal to a wider electorate, right? They don't just have just their party's voters and just their party's most partisan voters to appeal to. So those primary candidates are going to have to moderate to some extent. But even if they don't moderate, the idea is that because 4 candidates actually move on to the general election ballot, then the general election electorate, or the voters in the general election, are going to have more options than just 2 highly polarized primary candidates. The idea being that, let's say there's 2 Democrats and one is far left and one is center left, or there's two Republicans, far right or moderate right. The general electorate, which always tends to be more people and more centrist, more moderate, they'll have another option, right, than just the highly polarized option. Now, that's not to say a highly polarized candidate is a bad thing, right? I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. All I'm saying is that this process, this system, gives the voter an option to vote for a more moderate candidate if they want to, right? And that's essentially giving more choice and more freedom to voters. It's not necessarily saying that you should vote for the more moderate candidate. Now, there's probably good reasons why more moderate candidates are better ideas than more polarized candidates on both sides. But all this goes to say that in this Alaska system, especially, the primary candidates have to appeal to a broader range of the electorate, and then the general election voters have more options, both on the polarized side and the moderate side, to vote for. And just another quick vote about this ranked choice voting, it's called. Actually, Colorado has that at some local levels. Whether it's good or not, there's probably going to be some more of it, right? A lot of the changes that these states are making with this nonpartisan primary system and ranked choice voting system is in an effort to reduce polarization to some extent. And the way it works, just real quick, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A, but you essentially, you have 4 candidates, you rank your first choice, your second choice, third, fourth choice, or you can just rank 1 or 2, your top 1 or 2, and in that way, if it gets to it, your other third, fourth preference choices, or if you don't have a preference, they don't get one of your votes. But the idea is that if someone is in the lead after the first counting of the ballots, but doesn't have a majority, right? Then instead of that person winning with just a plurality, they call it, you can win with 30% of the vote, but the idea behind it is that it should be a majority of votes to win. So if someone does not have a majority of votes after that first round, then whoever came in last, that 4th place candidate, they get knocked out, and whoever voted for them as their first choice, their second choice gets distributed to the other candidates. And then you recalculate what those numbers are, and if one of those candidates then has a majority, they win. If they don't, then you knock out that third candidate and redistribute their votes until there's only 2 left, and then one of them will have a majority. So this is a new thing. There's arguments on both sides of it, but this is what Alaska has just done. And the idea behind it is that there are going to be examples. There's going to be situations where this doesn't help mitigate polarization. But over time and over jurisdictions, local, state, and federal, and then across the nation in different local, state, and federal elections, over time and across the geographic landscape, that the candidates who end up being elected and going into office will start to moderate. and their rhetoric will start to decrease. Their polarized rhetoric will start to come down. And I don't know if that's what's going to happen, if there's going to be unexpected consequences or what the case might be, but that's the theory behind it. And it's probably somewhat of a good theory. I usually don't give my opinion on things at Constitution Week. There is one thing that I will disclose. I guess I already disclosed that I'm an unaffiliated voter. I've always been. But there's one thing in which I tend to think, this is not something that I have found in my research on this topic, but I do tend to think that voters and an overwhelming majority of voters probably have a natural or default position of either being moderately right or moderately left, but that because of the intensity and the viciousness of the rhetoric coming from both sides, right? Both sides are guilty of this. That rhetoric pushes these otherwise moderate leaning voters farther away from the center, and because they feel like there's an existential attack, and this they might be justifiably so. They feel like there's an existential attack on their moderate right-leaning thoughts or their moderate left-leaning thoughts, and so that pushes them away. And that if somehow we can moderate the rhetoric and moderate the attacks that's coming from both sides, then those voters, or a lot of them, or hopefully many of them, will start to revert back to something of that natural, more default, moderate position. And then when you have moderately right candidates, and moderately left candidates, moderate policies, and I think most importantly, moderate rhetoric, then you're going to get more of an ability, more of an opportunity to actually work together, and actually, instead of defending against this existential attack and attacking existentially, because that's the way it feels. That's the environment that feels like it is. You'll be the politicians and the activists and the media, maybe even will be actually able to cooperate and do things and focus on issues that is in the best interest of in fact problems that exist. As Americans, or Coloradans, whatever it is, as opposed to making those decisions and speaking in a way, and behaving in a way that is really party first, and in America second. And I think that this does exist on both sides, and so to the extent we could get that that tweaking the system, right, the structure of elections, that is essentially another way of saying legislating, right, changing the laws on how primary elections are conducted, about how political parties have to select their candidates. The idea is that we could tweak that structure and those rules to allow for that moderation to happen, to allow for that maybe natural kind of water course of voters to move a little bit back towards moderation, and instead of being, feeling like they're under attack and needing to attack, then actually working together. And so I don't know if that's what's going to happen. There are other factors that figure into polarization, things like political gerrymandering. I talked about redistricting last year in my speech. Things like campaign finance. Maybe I'll talk about that next year, Mike. Maybe it's things like campaign finance rules. Things like just natural geographic sorting. A lot of like-minded people move to like-minded areas. And of course the role of all sorts of different media in polarization. But some of those might be more difficult to put your finger on. And therefore, if it's more difficult to put your finger on, it might be more difficult to actually address and change. But as far as the election, the primary election system, it is very tangible. It is pursuant to rules and laws passed by state governments, and states are changing those rules to potentially change the polarization that we see. And I'll just end on one thing, which is that sometimes you hear both sides, right? Both sides saying democracy is under attack, or is at risk, right? And the other side says, democracy is at risk because of you guys. Democracy is at risk because of you guys. I tend to think that democracy might be at risk, but if it's at risk, it's not because of one party or the other party, but it's because of polarization, right? It's because of this intensity and this viciousness that both sides feel like they need to, and sometimes maybe justifiably need to defend themselves and to counterattack, so that they aren't steamrolled. To the extent we can really fix that polarization, or at least moderate it, mitigate it to some extent, that could be what a democracy needs in order to protect itself, and then we could go on our merry way, dealing with our issues and having our debates, and fighting our fights, but fighting them or arguing about them in a moderate, civil, and productive way. So that brings me kind of to the end of these remarks. I do know that I've opened a lot of hopefully a lot of questions, but certainly a lot of issues about primary elections, how political parties work, how polarization might be a real issue, and how maybe to address it. So I'm happy to take your questions or comments.